This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to books and ideas and everything in between. This episode is brought to you by Yeshiva University's Center for Israel Studies and the Rabbi Arthur Schneier Program for International Affairs. I'm your host, Gilad Halpern, and my guest today is Associate Professor of Sephardic Studies here at Yeshiva and the Director of the Schneier Program. His book, Narratives from the Sephardic Atlantic, was published by Indiana University Press in 2017. It is a collective autobiography of three Iberian crypto-Jews in the late 16th and early 17th centuries, offering a sketch of a very particular social phenomenon against the backdrop of political upheavals deriving mainly from the opening up of new geographic, social and commercial spaces across the Atlantic. Professor Ronnie Perelis, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Welcome.
So can you tell us briefly about the origins and makeup of crypto-Judaism around that time, what it actually meant?
It's a great question.
Because it doesn't really have an answer. Is that why
I mean, part of it is, and even that term is a term which is argued about what's the proper term to talk about. Who are these people? What does it mean that they're crypto-Jews? Is that so some people are very strict to always refer to them as conversos until they actually leave and become full open Jews, whatever that, may look like. So, we can start with terminology, or we can start with chronology, depends on how you want to look at it. I like to start in Iberia, in Sfarad, and to kind of keep in mind that until 1492, this is the largest, most kind of substantial Jewish community in the world. And that's a kind of a big statement. As a historian, I don't like making big statements like that, but that's a pretty fair statement to make in terms of numbers, in terms of quality of, cultural production and status in society, all these different measures, you can easily make that argument. And this same group that's been living in the same soil for hundreds of years, in 1391 goes through a rupture of tremendous proportions. There are riots that break out throughout the country. And in the wake of those riots, there are murders and there are forced conversions and there are people running away and there are people who stay Jewish, sometimes by luck, sometimes because their town didn't have a riot or they got away in time or whatever it may be. And that begins this process of separation within Iberian society where you have people who stay Jewish, people who were converted in those riots, and they're in the same place. They don't really, they often live in the same neighborhoods, and their families are broken apart by these conversions and these acts of violence. So for 100 years leading up to what we think of as the end of Jewish life in Iberia, 1492, you have people who are, living side by side, often families connected to each other through family relationships, through business relationships, through just living in the same neighborhoods and having those associations, who some of them are on a path of living Catholic lives, at least religiously, and others are maintaining their Jewish lives like before, but nothing's like before because everything has changed, right? And so that's the beginning. And so you have 100 years of people who converted, some of whom want nothing to do with Judaism, certainly within a generation or two, and others who, for a mixture of reasons, will maintain either socioeconomic contact with Jews, right? My brother is my business partner, and just because I'm Catholic and he's Jewish, I'm not going to stop talking to him. I'm not going to stop doing business with him. I may go to his house Friday night. Is that an act of religious affiliation for me? Am I a secret Jew because I go to my brother's house for Friday night dinner and partake of the challah and partake of the wine and all that? Or is that just social? One step further, the conversos, as they were known, were accused of not being good Catholics. And one of the things that prominent theologians and historians would say about them is even their food, they still like the Jewish food. They like little dishes cooked in olive oil with a lot of garlic and eggplants. They describe these dishes and they sound quite good, but they avoid pork. So these are things, it's not a theological thing to like olive oil, garlicky eggplant that's cooked in olive oil, but it's a marker that you're still connected to that community. And so, But more importantly, I think for most of what became known as the old Christians surrounding them, these people were seen as not really one of them because they stayed in the same businesses as before. They kept to similar marriage patterns, marrying their children off at earlier ages than Catholics and marrying them off to business partners that were often other conversos and family members, quite honestly. So they maintained this kind of socioeconomic Jewish reality while going to church, sending their children into the clergy sometimes, and making their way into general Catholic society. And so there's this weird situation where you have people who are seen by the outside as not fully Catholic. They themselves, for the most part, don't do anything in terms of Jewish religion. But because they're seen in this way, they're kind of in this socioeconomic and cultural, in-between status that doesn't allow them to fully assimilate. Now, among that people, especially while there's still open Jews around, you have people who do secretly maintain some religious ties. And so those you could call crypto-Jews. Often, sometimes called Marranos or Anosim. You have these different terms for them, right? People who are living one way but secretly harbor some, whether it's a series of beliefs that are counter-Christianity or some vestiges of religious practices, avoidance of certain foods or whatever it is. And so that kind of is crypto-Judaism, which after the expulsion takes on a whole other, trajectory.
Yeah, interestingly, it seems like it's really the beginning of, cultural modernity in the way that, people perceive themselves and their identity and their participation in public life, just at the same time that, all sorts of other forms of modernity in terms of technology and, capitalism, the commercial aspect of it is beginning to emerge. It's not just a coincidence, right?
Right. It's like a lot of people look at Spain, as this kind of harbinger for the modern nation state and the imperial nation, European imperial colonial project. They were the first great imperial power with huge colonies. Even such little things like the colonization of islands like Madeira and the Canary Islands. These are these small islands off the coast of Spain, which had very few inhabitants those that were there were quickly, decimated and enslaved. And it's there that we have the first plantations. The first sugar plantation, right? Sugar used to be a very small amount of anyone's diet. It was a hard thing to develop, to cultivate. There, they set up a plantation and they bring in forced labor to work those. Sugar is notoriously a difficult crop to grow. And that starts in Madeira in the 15th century. So the model of what's going to then become this huge plantation society in the Americas, in Brazil and in Cuba and the south of the United States, all these places, that's already starting in embryo in early modern Spain, in that cusp of that. Also the movement to cities, right? One of the things that's so interesting about this time period, you see it come up in the literature of the time. People start moving. They move around. They start flooding Madrid. They start flooding Seville. And then they start going to the Americas and they start looking. So obviously most people don't move 10 miles from where they were born. But then you have this other resurgence of people who are hungry, looking for opportunities, who are just going all over the world. I mean, Spanish soldiers in Italy and in the Netherlands fighting, different imperial wars of the Habsburgs, people going to the Americas looking for new opportunities. And what you do when you move to those, when you leave your little town where everyone knew everything about you, when you do that, you can start anew. No one has to know who you are. And for conversos, this becomes very attractive because in my town, everyone knows that my grandfather converted. And everyone knows that maybe he got in trouble with the Inquisition. And everyone knows everything about me. But when I go to Seville, I can change my name. Who's going to know me who I am? I can be a new person. That all the stigmas from the past lose their way. For someone who's interested in maintaining Judaism secretly, so for that subset of people, that's also exciting because you can change your name. People don't know who you are, but also you can, paradoxically, you don't want to be alone, especially if you're part of this group. And you're going to look for people in your circle. So if you go to Seville, Seville was the official port to the Americas. You're going to find a lot of people in international trade. And those people in international trade very likely may be your family members or maybe someone who you know from your town. And then you can find yourself in a network there. So the search for socioeconomic sustenance and connections, will connect conversos to each other, but will also make them a target for inquisitorial investigations.
So in some way, ironically, in some way not, this forced conversion is what really propelled the Jews into participation in the broader activity of the state, of the market.
Yeah. You could argue maybe...
compared to other places in Europe.
Yes. It coincides. Jews in the earlier medieval period, in the when Islam was more prominent in Spain, kind of like the Islamic Golden Age, we know that Jews were highly involved in international trade. We know from the Geniza, constant movement from Spain to the Far East to India, going all over the place. That kind of dies down in Spain. The Jews in Spain, after the Christian reconquest of most Muslim territory, by the 13th, 14th century, are very localized. They're businessmen, they're still merchants, but they're much more localized. This changes with the 15th century. And what really happens is really Portugal. And that's an important piece. Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi, Zichrono Livracha, was one of the great historians of this phenomenon. And in one of his most important books, he goes out of his way to explain the importance of Portugal. And that's something I left out in that quick history, which is that the biggest block of Jews who wanted to stay Jewish, the biggest block went to Portugal in 1492. So they go to Portugal, and in Portugal, they fill the ranks of merchants. Everything from very low-level merchants moving material over from the border from Spain into Portugal, along the routes over the mountains in places like Bragança, which is today is this little town, as they say, where the devil has lost his way. It's like in the middle of nowhere. But in the 15th, 16th, 17th century was a central area for this really localized trade, right? And then obviously places like Lisbon and Porto, which were centers of international trade beginning in the 15th century. That's what people don't appreciate. We all think of Columbus. He changed everything. But already the Portuguese in the 15th century were going down the coast of Africa. They were very close to getting to India on their own. And because of the way society was set up in Portugal, there were not enough people who wanted to be in that middle class of merchants. There were plenty of people who wanted to collect the rents off the boats that were coming in and sell the licenses to buy and sell slaves and gold and all that. But there were much fewer people who were willing and able and had the skills and had the networks and had the necessity to risk going into this economic middleman status. And the Jews fit that very well in Portugal. There was a ready need for these types of people, and they became known as men of the nation / men of business. That was the term that the Portuguese used for them. 5 years later, the King of Portugal needs to marry off his son to the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, who will have nothing with a monarch who will have heretics and infidels living in his country. So he has a problem. He can't get rid of his Jews. His Jews are the business class. I mean, it sounds like a cliche. It sounds like the Protocols and Lords of Zion or something, but it was actually, they were filling that role, not exclusively. They were obviously Christians who were in that role, but an overwhelming majority were. So he, to make a very long story short, converts them all, forcibly converts them all, gives them 20 years, which was then extended through bribery into 40 years without inquisition. So for 40 years, the former Jews of Portugal, who are now conversos of Portugal, the new Christians of Portugal, another term that was used for them, are Catholics. At home, no one looked at what happened.
That's in the 1620s?
That is 1497.
So
1497 till the 1530s. And if you look, you see that when do the Jews, When do the former Jews, now conversos of Portugal, start really streaming out of Portugal? They don't do it right away. I mean, some do. I'm sorry. There are some people who very principally religious reasons, as soon as they can, escape Portugal after being forcibly converted. We have many cases of this. They're famous cases, but they're a minority, right? People who, but in the 1530s, the Inquisition starts working in Portugal, and that's when we see people leaving. Now, some do their best to get to places like Italy, where they can be openly Jewish, but most don't. Most stay in the Iberian world, but the Iberian world at that point is very big. The Iberian world could include the Netherlands, which were Catholic, where you couldn't be openly Jewish, but where the Inquisition didn't work the same way. They could go to Seville. Now, that is the heartland of the Inquisition, isn't it? And yet it isn't, because at that point, at that moment, the Spanish Inquisition was less active, was kind of freaking out about the Protestants and other sorts of heretics. Judaizing situation was less. So you see them going to the ports of the Iberian world, and they start flitting into the Caribbean, and they start going to Brazil, and they start going to Africa and India, all along these global routes. And they are part of and they set up through family businesses, set up these intricate family businesses that are transnational to some extent, or certainly global. And again, are those converso family businesses hotbeds of Judaism? Most cases not. But it's a convenient way to maintain your social identity, which then can get activated as a religious identity depending on an individual's experience. So that's kind of this network where these people come out
again,
of. Yeah.
Against this backdrop, the three protagonists of the book emerge.
Yeah.
And so first of all, I'll let you say their names because I don't want to mispronounce them. But tell us briefly about the biographies and why that you think that they are a case in point for that.
Okay, so I'll just briefly give incredibly briefly. Okay, Luis de Carvajal El Mozo, the younger. Luis de Carvajal was originally from Spain, a family who followed this path from Spain to Portugal, back to Spain. So notice that pattern. And he had an uncle who followed the classic pattern of a converso merchant. He does business with a Portuguese converso businessman in Seville, trades in the coast of Africa and Caribbean, marries his daughter, again, staying inside the converso orbit, doing converso jobs, and then has a change. And he goes on this different path, and he fights in wars against the Indians in Mexico. He works to get recognized by the crown and given a prize. And he takes really the path of the old Christian ideal of coming from the years of the Spanish Reconquista, the wars against the Muslims in Spain, where the ideal Christian value was to fight honorably against the infidel and then be rewarded with land and to live off your land, right? To enter into business was seen as a dirty endeavor. Obviously, no one wants to be poor and a peasant, but at least they're clean, right? In that sense. Or you could go to the church. Obviously, the church is a very nice thing to do, but it's not for everyone. So the ideal for the non-clergy was to be a Christian warrior against the infidel. Once it was finished against the Muslims, you have a whole continent now of Indians to fight. And so that he kind of goes on that path. He goes on that path. He gets rewarded with being the governor of a kind of godforsaken part of Mexico, the northern part of Mexico, the Nuevo Reino de León, which is where modern-day Monterrey is in the north of Mexico. A lot of desert, a lot of swamps, and some very rich silver mines, and some very violent, marauding, nomadic Indian tribes known as the Chichimecas. And so he needs people to come, and he invites his family, and he brings his family, and he himself seems to be a devout Catholic. His family is a mix. It's a weird mix. And either he turned a blind eye, he was willfully, either he willfully didn't know, or he hoped that it's unclear, and that's part of the story, and that's part of the exciting part of the story. But he brings him over and he names this Luis de Carvajal El Mozo, Luis de Carvajal the Younger, as his right-hand man, because he doesn't have children and he hopes to kind of, be able to pass it on. But life has a way of surprising you. And that's what happens to his family. It turns out that their Judaizing activities, their crypto-Judaic activities, their secret Sedarim and their secret Shabbat experiences and their all their beliefs and come out because they try to include someone who they assume would be part of the group, a converso who's somewhat related to them, one of the sisters who's a little bit not discreet about her Judaism, reaches out to this guy and he freaks out and turns them into the Inquisition. And that gets the family into the net of the Inquisition. But Luis de Carvajal lived in Mexico, was a very prolific writer, and eventually died at the stake after his second arrest by the Inquisition in 1596. And we have his autobiography, which is kind of an amazing text. It's the only text that I know of. I still haven't found one. The only text I know of, crypto-Jew who writes about their experience while living under the Inquisition. So we have a few people write about their experience once they've come to the lands of safety, the lands of liberty, or the lands of Judaism, as they call them. But he's the only one that I know of that talks about being a crypto-Jew while living as a crypto-Jew underneath the Inquisition, which is what gets him killed partially, right? Ultimately. So that's Luis de Carvajal. And he's probably the most studied of all the three that I look at, starting already in the 30s, Alfonso Toro, Martin Cohen in the 60s and 70s, Miriam Bodian, these, some many, many great scholars before me have come and analyzed his work and his life and his family's history from many angles. In Mexico, the family is a known historical entity. Diego Rivera includes Mariana de Carvajal in being burnt at the stake in one of his murals in the National Palace. So they're a figure, and so that's Carvajal. And then I go to a very different sort of person, Antonio de Montesinos, otherwise known as Aharon Halevi, who was a Portuguese converso who spent time in the Americas as a merchant, gets caught by the Inquisition, gets let off because they don't have enough evidence, but in prison has this revelation that the Indians that were his porters in the Andes were Jewish, and that he has to get to the root of that story. And so he tells the story of finding them again and going on a journey where he encounters the tribe of Reuben living in the Andes they have a very important messianic message for him to give to the rest of the Jews. He goes to Amsterdam, where there was an open Jewish community, shares this message, and a few years later, this text gets placed as part of Menachem ben Israel, the great Amsterdam rabbi's book, Mikveh Israel, or Esperanza de Israel, which is a book all about the 10 tribes and the question of the Messiah and when they're coming. And it's kind of a tour de force and kind of an anthropology, but it's an amazing book. But he includes this testimony of Aharon Halevi, Antonio de Montesinos there. And then the last is Manuel Cardoso de Macedo, who's a old Christian. In other words, no Judaism in his background. Old Christian from the Azores, the northern Portuguese islands in the North Atlantic, who first embraces Calvinism while living in England as a student. And then he is arrested by the Inquisition on a family trip home, in prison by the Inquisition for being a Calvinist. He meets a Jew, or someone who's accused of Judaizing, who blows his mind by hearing that people, because the accusations against him were things like keeping Saturday as the Sabbath and avoiding this and avoiding that. And him, as a good Bible-reading Calvinist, was amazed that there were people who still kept these rules, and it got him thinking, maybe I was wrong all these years. It's really Judaism. And eventually he goes on to find his way to Judaism and makes his way to Amsterdam, where he writes a very stirring autobiography that was preserved in the Eitz Chaim Library and studied by Bernard Tiensma in the 70s, and was mentioned here and there by different scholars. But again, just to follow back to your original question, what do these have to do with each other? And these are really different stories. These are different people and the way that they connect, first of all, they're autobiographies, autobiographical works. They're about these individuals writing about their lives. They're linked by experiences of crypto-Judaism. Even in the case of Manuel Cardoso, is an old Christian who becomes a Calvinist. He has a very pivotal period while he is living in Lisbon after being released from the Inquisition, where he lives with conversos as a crypto-Jew, even though he didn't convert yet officially, right? So crypto-Judaism links them and this Atlantic world. These are all people who are linked, are part of this incredibly interesting, bizarre, violent Atlantic network that links them. And the thing that I finally saw that really links them thematically and in terms of experience the lens that I use to talk about their experiences, and also it's the lens that allows me to go outwards, is the role of family as an organizing principle in their autobiographies, the importance of family as an idea of what I call spiritual families or families of faith, and blood families or biological families or sociological families, right? So you can be a spiritual brother to someone who has nothing to do with your bloodline, nothing to do with your ethnicity. Luis de Carvajal, one of his closest spiritual brothers, is a monk, an old Christian monk who he meets in prison and who embraces Judaism. And he writes about him as a blood brother. But yet he has a brother, a real brother, Gaspar, who is a Dominican, whose monastery is across the street from the Inquisition. And he has an uncle who he has the same name, who is a devout Catholic, right? So family is complicated, but it's also what links us, but it's also what breaks us. And so in each case, there is different vectors of that family, They're all intertwined with this open-endedness, this geographic open-endedness and the ability to travel. How do the two inform each other? Yeah, travel is so important. It's a bit cliche and it's very contemporary. You go someplace new and you have a different experience and you understand yourself better. These people were all traveling not because they were looking for a religious experience or wanted to find themselves. They were traveling because they were traveling a lot. But traveling changes you. You meet people that you wouldn't have met before. Manuel Cardoso is sent as a 14-year-old to England because his father does business in England. And he wants his son to have contacts there, to apprentice with business partners, to learn English. But guess what happens when you go to England? In the early 16th century, you're going to discover Protestantism. And when you're on your own and you're 14 or 15, you're a kid and you may want to rebel or you want to try something new. You want to fit in, whatever it is. And so he changes his life. And it's very interesting, you see him go back and forth, how he can sometimes hide his identity, sometimes not hide his identity on his trips back to the Azores, for instance. But then you have someone like Montesinos, the guy who meets with the people he believes were the tribe of Reuben in the Andes. He goes on a real journey, almost like, when I say real, a journey in the almost like New Age sense. The Indian porter that he originally had this insight that might be his link to this tribe. He turns to him and he says, okay, I'm going to show you your people. I will bring you to your people. This is after a very tense kind of exchange where they have to where he has to check him out, make sure he's for real. He says, I'm going to show you them, but you're not going to go like this. And you're not going to go like you went in the mountains before, where I was your servant and I carried your bags. You're going to leave all this behind. He says, you're going to leave back your capa y espada, your cape and your sword, right? It's like, in other words, all your Spanishness, all your power, all your trappings of who you are. You have to leave that all behind. You're going to go like me. You're going to wear rope sandals, alpargatas. You're going to carry your own stuff. You're going to eat corn like me. And we're going to go. We're going to travel together, and then you're going to see your brothers. So there's this stripping down of his Europeanness, of his colonial privilege, even though he's this kind of, in a very precarious colonial state, he's still a lot better than those Indian porters. right? And there's this way that his role gets inverted, and he's dependent on this guy to get access to his people, so to speak. And so that journey, again, is physical, but it's also, there's a psychological component there that...
You mentioned earlier their autobiographical work that makes up a big part of the study. And we've got to bear in mind that they were writing their autobiographies in a very dangerous time for them. There was a threat looming at every corner almost. How does that make your work as a historian? I'm sure it does make your work as a historian difficult, but to what extent did it really, make you treat it in a way that is more sensitive?
Yeah, that's the hard thing. And this is one of the raging debates in inquisitorial studies. If you have a document from the Inquisition, how do you read it? And this is one of the great debates of the last 50 years. Do you reject them all?
By the way, it's a problem with autobiographies in general, because people tend to, even when they're not under threat, they tend to big themselves up in autobiography. It's never entirely reliable, but I feel that in this case, it's even more so.
I came to this project originally from a literary approach, albeit very historically grounded. That's the way I was trained. And that gave me a lot of freedom, but also concern to read these texts not straight, to read them against the grain, to realize that people posture, that people present themselves in a particular way. This is self-fashioning. This isn't reporting. That certainly when they present themselves to the inquisitors, because in two cases, and this I didn't mention, but one of the great lucks of two of these cases is that we have the inquisitorial trials of Manuel Cardoso when he's in Lisbon, his two trials, because he was arrested twice. And we have Luis de Carvajal and his family's trials. So we have these records that often can play off the way they craft things later on in their autobiography. So there's this kind of shuttling between the archive and the self-fashioning archive, which gives all sorts of interesting... But even there, just because they say something to the inquisitors, again, memory plays tricks, and people want to present themselves in a particular way. Honestly, the hardest one was Montesinos, because Montesinos, who says he meets the tribe of Reuben, me as a modern person, it's a fantastical story. I don't understand what happened there. And the only way I can read it is in context with other stories like this. So, when Columbus is trying to make sense of this world he discovers, for instance, in his diaries. So he interprets what the indigenous people are telling him as things such as, in those islands there are Amazons. In those islands there are men with tails. In those islands there are men with dog heads. Now, that was Columbus hearing whatever he wanted to hear from through whatever signs the Indians were giving him, filtering it through the books he read. John de Manville and all these fantastical stories of the Far East and these magical beings. And he filters this new crazy world that he sees that he can't understand. And he's filtering it through the books he's read. So that's one of the things I try to do is contextualize them. What are other books like? What are other spiritual autobiographies like? Manuel Cardoso, how is his similar to what Christians are writing, what Protestants and Catholics are writing? Does it remind, it reminds you of some of these other classics. Luis de Carvajal, put it in context. What other writers, what other things are floating around in his world so that's one of the ways I deal with it. And I don't take it as a report, These are literally highly, and this isn't my own thing. So many scholars before me, especially in colonial studies, people reading Columbus, people reading Cortez, people reading, all the great classic, I learned from them, and they gave me a path forward, I think, on this, reading historically, but also realizing that these are creations, yeah.
All right, we'll have a bit of time for questions from the audience, if anyone's got a question.
So you say that the Antonio de Montesinos, he was the one that he was the most challenged. But do you think that there is a relation between Antonio de Montesinos and all the messianic thought of this era and with the Sabbatean movement? because all of them is looking for a reason and to find something that is bringing the Messias now?
The Messianism, first of all, I'll say one thing about the Montesinos text. It's the most problematic also because we don't have the original. The text we have is what Menashe ben Israel says he said. So it's mediated upon mediated upon mediated. But that's true of a lot of texts. There's a scholar, Margarita Zamora, who worked on Columbus's diaries. That was one of her great, explanations. She shows this text that we say is Columbus, she called it a corporate author. So even with Montesinos, he was a real person. We know we have some indication he was a real person and that this story circulated, that this wasn't made up by Menashe. And I don't impute ill will or, kind of evil machinations to any of the people. But what I do is what the direction you were mentioning. What was going on in the air? 20 years later, Shabtai Tzvi is making people crazy in Amsterdam, right? These new Jews of Amsterdam, as my teacher Yosef Kaplan has called them, these people who were Catholics, come to Amsterdam, embrace Judaism. When they hear about the Messiah coming and he's a real person, this is very exciting to them. This is kind of changing the world. But they has earlier premonitions. Christians were the first ones interested in Montesinos' story. Christians believed it was a Protestant theologian living in Amsterdam who first asked Menashe, hey, can you tell me more about this guy and what his story was? Because I have a friend in New England who says that he thinks the Indians there are Jews. The American Indian, the Jewish Indian theory or the Israelite Indian theory was very popular as in European intellectuals are trying to make sense of who are these people? Who are these diverse, very different people? The Bible never said anything about them. How do they fit? The Bible didn't say anything about these continents. How does that fit? And this is part of this whole amazing intellectual revolution that comes along the same time as, you were talking about earlier about modernization, stuff like that. The printing press, where tons of information can go very quickly around the world. People traveling, people discovering new things. So the Indians, they didn't understand. For the Europeans, they had to find a box for them. Well, who are they? How do we figure them out? So one theory, it wasn't the only theory, but one theory was, maybe they're the 10 tribes. And that can explain why they're so terrible. That can explain why, they have so idolatrous, because the 10 tribes were very idolatrous, and explain why they're like this. Or I can explain why they're so noble. And, whatever. You can be, you can always use it for whatever you want. So 100 years before Montesinos, we have David Reuveni, right? A Jew who shows up in Italy saying, I am from the tribe of Reuben. My brother is the king, and I'm on a mission to get the Pope to band together with us against the Muslims and take back the Holy Land. That was a real person. He was imprisoned and killed eventually, but he had a run. He made it. He was a celebrity for a long time. The story of Prester John. The Portuguese send a real embassy. They send real people to the heart of Africa to find Prester John. So these are fantasies, but they're real. I mean, people act on them. So I see him in that text, but also because I care about that literary piece to it, I'm really interested in how this persona of Antonio de Montesinos, what's going on in what's the psychological kind of journey that he's taking as well. So I care about all that other stuff. I think it's essential. You can't understand the text without it. But I'm also interested, what else is going on? What about I see a whole, ethical transformation happening in him. Maybe I read too much into that, but I see it there. And so I go there. In a way that very often, for instance, the indigenous question, the question of race is something that comes up in all of these texts, especially with Montesinos. Race, blood, all these things are very important. I find it very strange that someone like Luis de Carvajal, who writes about so much, is living among indigenous peoples, is assigned after his arrest to teach Latin in a premier elite school in Santiago de Tlatelolco, to teach Latin to kind of the elite of the Indian elites. He never talks about them. He has no important relationships with them. it's interesting to me. That absence is interesting. It says a lot, I think, about it, about what does it mean to be part of the colonial structure and part of, and then you have someone like Montesinos who really grapples, or the text, at least, I would say the text grapples with race and grapples with and raises some of these issues. Doesn't resolve them, certainly, but certainly, yeah.
All right. Professor Ronnie Perelis, thank you very much for joining us today.